Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. We've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working-class woman.
Words slipped from Keir Starmer's mouth that no one expected to hear. Words that could end his career in a single moment. In front of millions watching live, a shocking revelation exploded into the air like a thunderclap, leaving the studio frozen in silence and the nation stunned. For years, rumours swirled about hidden plans, secret deals, and a quiet push to drag Britain back into the European Union. But this wasn't gossip anymore. This was live, of undeniable and brutally raw. And now the man who positioned himself as the saviour of Labour may be walking straight into his own downfall. The storm around Keir Starmer has been building for months, but what unfolded on live television has turned a political crisis into an unstoppable inferno. It started as a routine appearance, another chance for Starmer to brush off criticism, defend his policies and project control. But control is exactly what he lost. With the nation's eyes fixed on him, his mask slipped. A tense exchange forced him into a corner, and suddenly his words revealed more than he ever intended. For years, whispers have suggested that Starmer's ultimate ambition was never about stabilising Britain after Brexit. It was about reversing it piece by piece, through backroom agreements, legal manoeuvres, and shadowy promises to European officials. On live TV, his slip was not just a mistake. It was an admission, the kind of admission that cannot be taken back, cannot be explained away, and cannot be buried under spin. As the revelation spread like wildfire, the immediate reaction was disbelief. Viewers replayed the clip again and again, trying to process what they had just heard. Commentators fell into chaos. Some sat in stunned silence while others erupted with anger, declaring that Britain had just witnessed the unmasking of the greatest political betrayal in decades. For ordinary people, it wasn't just about policy, it was about trust. Millions who voted for Brexit felt as though their decision, their voice and their future had been deliberately undermined. The backlash was instant, merciless and unforgiving. Protesters took to the streets, chanting betrayal, demanding resignation and warning of a constitutional showdown. Behind closed doors, Labour insiders scrambled. What was supposed to be a show of leadership had turned into a moment of collapse. MPs whispered about survival, about whether Starmer could weather the storm, or whether the time had come to push him aside before the entire party imploded. The Supreme Court's recent rulings, already hammering against his secret EU strategies, only made matters worse. Britain's highest judges had drawn a line in stone. The law would not be twisted to reopen the door to Brussels. And now, with Starmer's own words exposing his intentions, that line had become a wall he could never climb. The timing could not have been more devastating. With pressure from Reform UK surging, with Conservatives circling like sharks smelling blood, and with his own party fracturing under the weight of mistrust, Starmer's grip on power looked weaker than ever. Every second after the revelation was a second closer to resignation. Political history has seen many leaders fall, but rarely so fast and rarely so publicly. Britain is now bracing for the unthinkable, the resignation of a Prime Minister, not after an election, not after months of scandal, but after a single moment that ripped the truth into the open and shattered his authority beyond repair. Starmer's crisis deepens by the hour. What began as whispers in the corridors of Westminster has now exploded into a public firestorm. After the revelations aired on live television, millions across Britain were left asking the same question. Has Keir Starmer betrayed the country he swore to serve? What makes this moment even more devastating for him is the fact that the controversy does not stand alone. It comes stacked upon years of doubt, mistrust and accusations that Starmer never truly revealed his hand to the people. And now, with the Supreme Court's shocking intervention against his secret EU plan, the suspicion that he was quietly plotting Britain's return to Brussels without the consent of the voters has become too powerful to ignore. The tension is so thick that even Labour MPs, once loyal foot soldiers, are beginning to scatter like frightened birds, distancing themselves from the man who only weeks ago appeared untouchable. What viewers saw on live television was not just a political gaffe, it was a revelation that could end a career. The carefully polished image of Starmer as the rational, steady leader was stripped away in an instant. In its place, a man cornered, caught off guard and unable to defend himself against the tidal wave of evidence and accusations being hurled his way. And for the people watching, it was confirmation of what many had suspected, that his words about protecting Britain's sovereignty were nothing more than smoke and mirrors, while backroom deals and hushed agreements told the real story. The sense of betrayal cut deep. After Brexit, the nation fought bitterly over its future, but one thing was clear. Britain's independence was hard won. To think that the Labour leader was quietly drafting a path back into the arms of the EU without permission of the people ignited outrage that spread like wildfire across every corner of the country. Parliament is now in chaos. The Conservative opposition has seized on the scandal like vultures circling a wounded animal, demanding Starmer's resignation and framing him as the greatest political deceiver of the modern era. Reform UK, meanwhile, has found itself suddenly elevated, capitalising on the anger of ordinary citizens who feel tricked and abandoned by the very establishment that swore to represent them. And in the midst of it all, the Supreme Court's ruling delivered the final crushing blow. Judges declared his EU plan unconstitutional, a direct violation of the principles laid out by Brexit, and made it crystal clear that the Labour leader had no legal authority to pursue such a path. It was a humiliation played out in front of the entire nation, a leader struck down not by his political rivals, but by the highest court in the land. For Starmer, the humiliation was unbearable. He tried to maintain his composure as he stood in front of the cameras, but the cracks were obvious. His words faltered, his hands shook, and every time he attempted to deflect the accusations, more revelations poured in from journalists, whistleblowers, and even members within his own party who had finally decided to abandon the sinking ship. The narrative that once painted him as a strong, dependable leader was destroyed in a single evening, and no matter how desperately he tried to claw back control, the tide had already turned against him. This was not just a scandal, it was political annihilation. And Starmer stood at the very centre of the storm. The fallout was immediate, and it was devastating for Keir Starmer. The media, already circling like vultures after the Supreme Court ruling, now had blood in the water. Headlines screamed betrayal, corruption and conspiracy. Talk shows debated not whether Starmer could survive, but how soon he would fall. The shocking revelations on live TV had pierced through the last shield of defence he had, and his opponents wasted no time. Within minutes, political commentators began to label him the most compromised leader in modern British history. MPs who once stood firmly by his side were now silent, some even privately briefing journalists against him. It became clear Starmer was bleeding political capital, and his enemies were tightening the noose. The mood in Westminster turned electric, with whispers spreading that a resignation was not just possible, it was imminent. What made the revelations even more destructive was the timing. Britain was already on edge after the Supreme Court dismantled his secret EU plan, and now the public was confronted with the raw truth of what he had been hiding. Trust had evaporated overnight. In the streets, the reaction was even more explosive. Protesters gathered outside Parliament, their chants shaking the foundations of Westminster itself. Resign, they cried, their voices echoing through the city. Anger that had been simmering for months now erupted into fury. And Starmer found himself trapped between the people's rage and his own collapsing party. It wasn't just the far right or Brexit supporters, it was ordinary citizens, disillusioned and furious at what they saw as a deliberate betrayal of their will. Social media platforms exploded with clips of the live revelation, replayed millions of times, fueling outrage and disbelief. For many, this was the final straw, proof that the political class had been playing games with the nation's future. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party and Reform UK seized the opportunity with ruthless efficiency. Reform's leaders declared that this was the moment to take back control once and for all. while Tory figures framed Starmer's collapse as evidence that Labour could not be trusted to govern. Their speeches carried a sharp edge, calling for new elections and demanding accountability. Even Labour's own MPs began to fracture, some distancing themselves from Starmer in the hope of saving their own careers. A leadership contest within Labour suddenly seemed inevitable, as names of possible successors were whispered in hushed tones across the corridors of power. But perhaps the most shocking development came from within the Labour movement itself. Key allies, people Starmer had relied on for years, began to question his leadership in public. Shadow cabinet members offered carefully worded statements that sounded less like support and more like preparation for life after Starmer. For a man who built his image on control, the loss of loyalty was catastrophic. One by one, the pillars of his leadership began to crumble, leaving him exposed. It was clear that Starmer could not survive without his base of support, and that base was slipping through his fingers. The question now was not if he would resign, but whether he would be forced out before he had the chance. The sense of inevitability hung over Westminster like a storm cloud. Even senior figures within Downing Street reportedly braced themselves for the shock announcement. Political insiders revealed that contingency plans were already being drawn up for a Labour leadership vacuum, with some suggesting that the King himself might soon need to intervene to maintain stability. Britain had entered uncharted waters. Never before had a party leader fallen so quickly, so spectacularly, and under such public pressure. The entire nation was now waiting, holding its breath, for Keir Starmer's next move. The crisis did not remain confined to Westminster. It spread like wildfire through every corner of the nation. In cities, towns and villages, the sense of betrayal was felt as though a dagger gun had been plunged into the heart of democracy itself. Outside the Supreme Court, where the ruling had been delivered, thousands gathered with placards, their voices echoing through the streets. "No more lies," they shouted, a chant that carried the raw anger of citizens who felt they had been manipulated for far too long. Across social media, hashtags surged to the top within minutes. Starmer resign. Betrayal of Britain and Unmasking. Each one a digital scream from a public that refused to remain silent. For the first time in decades, it seemed as though the people were not only awake but united in their fury. What was once dismissed as political theatre had transformed into a national awakening. It was no longer about party politics, it was about survival, sovereignty and the trust between government and governed. Within Parliament itself, the chaos was indescribable. MPs shouted across the chamber, their voices clashing in a storm of accusations. Some called for an immediate general election, demanding that the people be given the final say. Others insisted that Starmer's resignation was not enough, that those who had supported or hidden his secret EU dealings must also be held accountable. Names were being whispered, alliances questioned, and friendships shattered under the crushing weight of scandal. The opposition benches roared with triumph, sensing their moment had arrived, while members of Starmer's own party sat in stunned silence, faces pale with fear and uncertainty. The Speaker of the House struggled to maintain order, but the chamber had already descended into something that looked less like politics and more like an arena of survival. Starmer, meanwhile, sat hunched in his seat, eyes fixed on the floor as though the walls themselves were closing in. But the storm was not only political, it was legal. Lawyers, constitutional experts and journalists all weighed in on the Supreme Court's devastating judgment. Some argued that the ruling was unprecedented, a historic blow that might redefine the limits of government power forever. Others suggested it was merely the beginning, warning that further legal challenges could emerge, targeting not only Starmer, but also those in his inner circle. Questions were raised about who knew what and when. Did senior figures in the cabinet stay silent while Starmer tried to drag Britain back under Brussels' shadow? Were officials within Whitehall complicit in keeping this plot hidden from the public? The very fabric of government was being ripped apart thread by thread, leaving the public to wonder whether corruption had poisoned the system far deeper than anyone dared to admit. Meanwhile, outside Britain's borders, the shockwaves reached Europe. Leaders in Brussels reacted with fury, some calling the court's ruling a betrayal, others accusing Britain of being untrustworthy and unstable. Secret documents began to surface, allegedly showing just how far Starmer had gone in his attempt to realign Britain with the EU. Promises of concessions, discussions about shared policy control, even whispers of Britain rejoining EU economic structures, all without parliamentary approval. For ordinary Britons who had voted for Brexit, these revelations were not just shocking, they were a slap in the face. Millions felt as though their voices had been ignored, their decision trampled on, and their democracy hijacked by a leader who thought he knew better than the people. But perhaps the most chilling element of all was the growing speculation that this was not merely the failure of one man, but part of a larger conspiracy. Whispers began to spread of secret meetings, hidden funding, and foreign influence shaping British politics behind closed doors. Commentators warned that if Starmer could attempt such a plot in secret, what else had been concealed from the public eye? Some began to draw comparisons to past political scandals, but this was something far greater. It was not a minor cover-up or a misused expense account. This was the deliberate attempt to rewrite Britain's future without the consent of its people. It was, in the eyes of many, nothing less than treason. And yet, through all of this chaos, one question rose above the rest, like a thunderclap. What comes next? Starmer's position was already untenable. His own MPs were turning on him. The press was circling like wolves. And the people were demanding justice. Could he survive another week, another day, even another hour in office? Or had the dam finally broken, leaving him with no escape? Britain was on a knife's edge, its political order collapsing before the eyes of the world. The stage was set for a reckoning unlike anything in modern history. The moment the revelations broke live on television, the entire country held its breath. The Prime Minister, who had built his career on carefully chosen words, quiet deals, and a calm, controlled image, suddenly had the mask ripped away. And it wasn't by political rivals, it was by the weight of truth, carried through the Supreme Court and amplified across the airwaves. The camera caught it all, the hesitation in his voice, the unease in his eyes, the silent collapse of a man who thought he could control history. Viewers saw not a leader, but a man cornered, trapped by his own ambition. The resignation whispers quickly turned into roars. "He can't stay," said one political commentator. "He won't survive this." The truth was undeniable. Starmer's time was ending, not with a dignified exit, but with the shame of exposure. Across Britain, the reaction was unlike anything seen in decades. In working men's clubs, in pubs, in homes across Scotland, Wales and England, ordinary people cheered at the news that Starmer's EU conspiracy had been torn apart. Farmers in the Midlands, fishermen in Cornwall, steelworkers in the north, all who had feared their livelihoods would be sacrificed to Brussels, felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Even in London, where support for rejoining the EU was stronger, there was a different kind of mood. Betrayal. Many of Starmer's own supporters felt deceived, furious that he had played such a dangerous double game with their future. The betrayal was not just political, it was personal. Trust had been shattered. Meanwhile, inside Westminster, panic turned into chaos. Ministers who once defended Starmer began to distance themselves at lightning speed. Letters of no confidence were already being drafted. Allies avoided his calls, knowing the end was near. One senior MP described the atmosphere as rats fleeing a sinking ship. The Supreme Court ruling had not only dismantled his plan, but had unleashed a chain reaction that no spin doctor could control. Every headline screamed the same truth. Starmer's leadership is finished. His enemies circled like vultures, but even his friends knew the fight was over. He had no path forward, no way to rebuild. And so the question that now grips the nation is simple but profound. What happens next? Will Starmer resign in disgrace within hours? Will Labour attempt to hold the party together under a caretaker leader? Or could Britain face the unthinkable, another general election, throwing the entire country back into political warfare? The Supreme Court may have destroyed Starmer's EU plan, but in doing so, it has opened a new chapter of uncertainty for Britain. The people are awake, the anger is raw, and the demand for accountability is louder than ever. One thing is clear, history was made not in the quiet halls of Brussels, but in the roar of the British people and the judgment of the highest court in the land. Starmer gambled everything and lost. Now Britain stands on the edge of something new, with his resignation not just expected, but inevitable. And as the dust settles, one truth echoes across the nation: the will of the people cannot be ignored, and those who try will always face the same fate: defeat, humiliation, and the end of power.